Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be back again talking about something serious as opposed to the University of Cambridge, but namely the monarchy. My current work in both media terms, that's to say television, and my academic work is looking at the institution of monarchy. Now that seems, in a sense, a contradiction in terms. At least on this side of the Atlantic, monarchy, and the British monarchy in particular, tends to be seen as merely gossip column material. You know, filler for Princess Diana's studies, which I know is taken very seriously in some universities, but not Cambridge. Now, what I want to do is something very different. In the television series, I'm looking at the history of the monarchy of England, subsequently Britain, from the beginning, and I was going to say till the end, but that would slightly anticipate things. In other words, from the Anglo-Saxons right up to the present day and the strange Götterdämmerung of the House of Windsor. The reason I do this is twofold. Particularly, the monarchy is the only English institution which is actually continuous, with the possible exception of the Church of England. But as I shall describe later, the Church of England has achieved the nearly impossible and eradicated Christianity from the Church. So it's a very strange thing, and really, in its present tortured avatar, doesn't really have much resemblance to anything like the medieval church, or still less the Anglo-Saxon church. So the monarchy is the one continuous lens through which you can actually look at the history of England and the history of Britain. And that seems to me to be very important. The other way round, turning, as it were, the telescope round in the other direction, is that monarchy, I think, is also a universal. This is a very dangerous thing to say in a republic, and I apologize for it, but human beings seem essentially to be hardwired for monarchy. Almost all institutions are monarchical, starting very obviously with the University of Cambridge. We live under the reign of a kind of benign Catherine the Great. True enlightened despotism. It hasn't yet turned into despotism modified by riot or by epigram or all the sorts of things that it was in the 18th century. But Alison, beware, we are a rebellious lot. But it extends much further than that. If one looks, for example, at America, what you have is a monarchy, full stop. You have an elective monarchy, but then so does the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church, to say nothing of America, is the world's only surviving, genuine, absolute monarchy, in which whatever a pope, in whatever condition of physical health, gets up and thinks his doctrine is doctrine, if you're foolish enough to believe him. So, now, the American presidency is a more complex animal. I always used to say, when I was trying to explain the American Constitution to my students, and incidentally, the monarchy is not the only borrowing. The whole structure of American federal government is closely modelled, not on that of Rome, whose fancy dress it wears, and whose architecture it invokes, and whose eagles, rather improbably, it flaunts. It is instead based on, obviously, England of the 18th century, systematized, rationalized, and crucially, eventually, democratized, which is why your history has gone in such a wildly different direction from that of England and Britain herself. But if you look, for example, at the Senate is merely an elective House of Lords. To begin with, you were indirectly elected. Remember, the Constitution Amendment providing for direct election to the Senate is only post-First World War. But if you actually look at the senators, each one of them rejoices in a quasi-noble status, 2 per state, the kind of Duke of Minnesota, or, the Earl of Oregon. And do they not? They have effectively life tenures. They have, like the British peerage, access to loot and pillage and reward their followers. Occasionally, one or two of them get found out, and there's a process, well, what is there? Eventually, there are processes, of course, going right up to the president itself, of impeachment, which is taken straight from the medieval English constitution. The process that Clinton narrowly escaped of trial before the Senate with the House of Representatives acting as prosecutors. What are the House of Representatives? They are simply the Commons. Their presiding officer is called the Speaker. What is even more bizarre to American ears, the administrative officer is the person whom you cannot pronounce, the Sergeant at Arms. Now, nobody has any idea on Capitol Hill why the House is run by the Sergeant at Arms. It's simply because the Sergeant at Arms is the representative official of the is the administrative official, the disciplinary official of the Commons in England. So the President is a monarch. I used to say until Reagan was elected, he was simply George III without a wig. But then Reagan came along, and the joke fell almost as flat as his hair was bouffant. You also have a court, as all monarchs have courts. America is ruled by a cabinet chosen purely by the president. And the key officers do not sit in the cabinet. The key officers are genuine courtiers, the rogues of the night, those dark things that wander around in the backstairs of power, just as they do in Downing Street in London, where we, of course, have two monarchs. We have Queen Elizabeth II, this artificial, frail monarch, and the real monarch, King Tony I, with, of course, and much darker creatures of the night, like Mandelson and Alistair Campbell, who would do credit to the Thomas Cromwells, to the thugs of the late Middle Ages, and exercise power in that same dark, concealed fashion. And of course, these elective monarchs have consorts. We have Queen Cherie. The last time she appeared in public in Britain, her dress was described, because it's now the material of not simply couturiers, but serious political analysis. Her dress at this evening reception was described as a striking confection off the shoulders, without sleeves, worn with long bejewelled gloves, with a tight high bodice, a flared skirt, and the whole modelled on the costume of ladies of the French aristocracy in the 18th century. Nobody, of course, had explained to her what happened to the French aristocracy in the 18th century, but still you get the idea. So monarchy is, in other words, what I'm trying to say, monarchy is a universal. It's something that's serious. It's there. Virtually every organization, be it a state, be it a company, be it a university, be it a school, is run essentially monarchically. And one of the reasons we so misunderstand our politics is that we take seriously the decent veil of constitutionality that hangs over this brute fact. So the study of monarchy, which has been completely neglected academically, is one that is really seriously worth making. It's worth making even if you're looking in terms, for example, of business history. Business history has, of course, a very brief life. The continuous documentation of the corporation is less than 100 years old. The documentation of monarchy, which I would argue is a strictly analogous form of government, is about 2,000 years old. And if you look at some of the older monarchies, like Pharaonic Egypt, stretches way, way back. It would be worth the analysis of power, power control, power distribution, power replication, looking at this much broader pattern. But what I want to do with you this afternoon is to come down from these airy generalizations and to look in particular at the history of what becomes the British monarchy. That's another decent constitutional fiction. The monarchy is the monarchy of England. The ordinal numbers of sovereigns are the ordinal numbers of the sovereigns of England. For example, when Queen Elizabeth II succeeded in 1952, there was the most terrific hoo-ah in Scotland, because there'd never been a Queen Elizabeth I of Scotland. So pillar boxes were blown up, because E2 appeared on them, which Scots didn't recognise. The coronation is the English coronation. The oaths are the English oaths. The relationship with Parliament is the relationship with the English Parliament. So the lineage then is this very, very long lineage. But what I want to do is to look at it at exactly the moment when all the conventional textbooks tell you it becomes unimportant. I am a great believer that you stand things on their head. One of the key things in academic study is to look at things hard and to try shaking them around a bit and looking at them from odd perspectives, taking nothing for granted. And this applies just as much in art subjects as in the natural sciences. So what I really want to do is, rather than having some complacent analysis of the residual constitutional importance of the British monarchy, which I would argue is negligible, none of any significance whatever, I want instead to look at why we still have a monarchy. Why the thing survives at all. Because, of course, Britain, in the last century or so, the last 100 and 120 years, since the 1880s, 1890s, has undergone, arguably, the most radical social transformation in Europe. It has certainly undergone a quite extraordinary process of social transformation. So why has the monarchy survived at all? To put the question the other way round, what does it actually do? Many people have asked, few have answered. You will this afternoon hear, as it were, something unique. You will hear an attempt at giving a serious answer to that question. Now, the issue of survival of the monarchy loomed very, very large in the minds of those advising the sovereign in the last 2 decades of Victoria's reign. In the 19th century. Traditional accounts of British history, of course, stress Victoria's popularity. They stress the sort of middle-class nature of the monarchy of Victoria and Albert, its respectability, and so on. They gloss over completely the fact that the high watermark of English republicanism is the 1870s, when you actually had at least one overt republican sitting in the cabinet. Something never repeated in the 20th century. And the advisors of Victoria were desperately concerned that her invisibility, her withdrawal from public view, to say nothing of gossip, which turns out almost certainly to be true about her relationship with John Brown, was besmirching the public reputation of the monarchy. And a group of people arise. I've talked about these dark figures at court, backstairs intriguers, but intriguers for once with intelligence, arise who recognize that the monarchy is in danger in the late 18th century, in the late 19th century, the late 1800s. It is at risk. And what they do is to come up with a quite extraordinary series of reinventions. We talked this morning about the University of Cambridge and transformation and change and how change happens as one looks at very big causes and very small causes. Now, obviously, the background to the changes, the background to the at-risk nature of the monarchy in the late 19th century was the fundamental shift in British politics which follows 1867, the Second Reform Act, and the beginning of mass democracy, a popularly elected House of Commons, rather than a selection process within the political elite, which America, of course, with its voting turnout dropping towards the 50%, is rapidly replicating. The elite simply squabbles amongst itself, leaving the poor and dispossessed outside, exactly as the unreformed House of Commons did in Britain. But anyway, all that aside. But the great threat to the monarchy is the advent of genuine popular rule, because the monarchy is the aristocratic institution par excellence. And what you're doing throughout the 19th century is shifting away from narrowly aristocratic government. How is monarchy actually to survive this change? Well, the answer is it's got to adapt. It's got to change. It itself has got to transform. But how on earth do you have the paradox of a democratic monarchy? It is an extraordinary paradox. And yet Britain, England, is the first country to bring about this formula with extraordinary success, which is why the monarchy, despite the disasters, the mishandlings, the folly of the last 30 years, is still there. Let's look A, at how the process is conceived, and B, at how it's done, and C, who did it. The key figure, as I said, one of these creatures of the night, is an extraordinary man called Reginald Brett, Viscount Esher. Esher's entry in DNB is quite astonishing. It lists all the offices that he refused, beginning with the Viceroy of India, the Secretary of State for War, the position of effective Chief of the General Staff. It's a staggering list. He was the supreme operator, but he preferred the dark. Esher is very unusual for other reasons. He is, of course, an Etonian. Very strange creature, kings and whatever. He's also half French. His mother is French, which makes him even stranger. And in the world of late Victorian England, he is bisexual, with an extraordinary penchant for Eton sixth formers, including allegedly his own second son, with whom he was passionately in love. All of this in Victorian England. These separate lives, these parallel lives. So he is a man peculiarly aware of the theatre of human existence. His entire life is theatre, is a show, is a performance, like monarchy itself. And he is brilliant at handling this. He is, in fact, seriously interested in the theatre, and he is an aficionado of the stage door, actors, actresses, whatever. We needn't investigate too much. But he's also widely read, highly literate, and deeply aware of French history. And he knows they're about to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. Only, whatever it is, 2 years, 1889, will be the 100th anniversary, 2 years after Victoria's Golden Jubilee, when she actually celebrates her anniversary of coming to the throne. He is determined that England will not have a French Revolution, that there will not be tumbrils in England. Now, you may think I exaggerate. Read his papers. This is the concern. It is, how do you damn what he sees as an irresistible tide? Remember, we think of democracy as a nice word. Actually, many of the world's nastiest regimes have been democracies. In other words, what we like is liberal democracy. Democracy trammelled by rules, by the rule of law, by the rule of property. Most democracies aren't like that. If you look at the Greeks, if you look at Aristotle and more particularly Plato, democracy there is a defective form of government. It's essentially the rule of the poor over the rich, the majority over the minority. And Esher is determined, as somebody who is rich, the minority, powerful, not to suffer. And the key role of monarchy is going to be the management of the process of transformation from an aristocratic society to a democratic society. That's the polite way of looking at it. It could also be argued it is about the subversion of democracy, the management of democracy, the substitution, if you like, to go back to the Greeks again, of Plato's cave, of satisfying pretty pictures which keep the common people happy. If you like, monarchy is the opium of British democracy. So, let's look at how Esher goes about doing this. I've already mentioned the key events. The key events are the celebrations of Victoria's accession, the Golden Jubilee of 1887, the Diamond Jubilee of 1897. These are stage managed by Esher like an impresario. They are planned, they are designed, they have a purpose, they have scripts, they have rehearsals. But the key thing about them is they are utterly different from preceding royal ceremony. I mentioned England being aristocratic. You all in this room, most of you, the overwhelming majority of you, having spent time at Cambridge, are actually familiar, though you don't know it, with what aristocratic ceremony looks like. It's just like academic ceremony. It's shambolic. I don't know what your degree day was like. My degree day, the only memory that I have of when I took my BA is the fact, and this of course was a male vice-chancellor, it wouldn't possibly happen with Alison, but my only memory is the size of the hole in the vice-chancellor's sock. It was rather ill-washed, matted grey wool with this sort of, bluish-white flesh protruding through his... His name was Grave. It was very appropriate. I mean, it was... nicknamed Taphos for all the classicists here. Anyway, that's, in other words, a mess. You look at typical processions to high table, gowns that are mildew, that are tattered, that are worn conspicuously off the shoulder, gowns worn over leather jackets, over denim, over everything that's not appropriate. Isn't it true? Right. Now, aristocratic ceremony is just like that, because it's carried out within a group who know, right? It's carried out amongst the cognoscenti. And the archetypical example of aristocratic ceremony, and the last undiluted example of it, was Victoria's own coronation, the thing which was being celebrated in 1837. It's very, very extraordinary. The ceremony, after all, lasts at least 3 hours. It involves complex movements by elderly gentlemen wearing long robes. And they did it without any rehearsal. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who was as blind as a bat, forgot his spectacles and started off with the prayer book upside down. He then continued to what was one of the most sacred moments of the coronation, where the coronation ring is placed on the Queen's fourth finger. He did manage to see the hand, he got the right finger, he had the ring in the other hand, and he started to put it on. Then he encountered resistance, and with this blind and stupid obstinance, he continued pushing. And Queen Victoria describes in her wonderful diaries and letters, it was as much as she could do not to scream at this moment of solemn ceremony as the ring was forced over one joint and the next. What had happened was they had measured her little finger rather than her fourth finger, and it took some hours of soaking in ice water and the combined tugging of ladies in waiting to get the thing off afterwards. But that wasn't the culmination of absurdity. It was at the moment of homage, when the peerage in strict order of rank, beginning with the royal dukes and ending with mere barons, go up the multitudinous steps of the throne in these long, heavy, velvet, fur-lined robes, balancing, the whole caboodle of coronets and the whole thing, to kneel in front of the monarch, place their hands, exactly what you do when you take your degree at Cambridge. You do all realize you're performing feudal homage. When you go down on your knees, you raise your hands, and the Vice-Chancellor encloses your hands in his or hers. That is feudal homage. Anyway, the peerage does this, and it came finally to the last group of the peerage, and one of the least important members of the peerage, a baron called Lord Rolle, R-O-L-L-E, Lord Rolle. And he was very old and probably rather drunk and certainly blind. And as he came to mount the steps, he got to the penultimate step and then fell and rolled down the steps of the throne. Not to be defeated, he got up again, rushed up, and to immense cheers slipped again and rolled back. By this time, the congregation, it's not quite right, the word, the audience was wild with enthusiasm, and he made a third attempt and was about to fall back when the Queen leaned forward and the maids leaned forward and everybody else caught him, and he just about got through it. And bemused foreigners were told afterwards that this was in fact an ancient ritual, that called the invention of tradition, that the barony of Rolle was held by the service of rolling down the throne. You think I'm inventing it? It's not. It is absolutely true. Now, why can you get away with this? In the same way you can get away with dons in mildewed and tattered gowns, because everyone's in the know. But what happens when the great unwashed are admitted? When you turn royal ceremony inside out. So instead of it taking place within the abbey, which was sealed off, to which it was entry only by ticket holders, to which the common folk were not admitted, you turn ceremony round and you deliberately make it a performance for the new masters of the nation, the common people. Suddenly, you can't have mistakes. These people are used to performance. These are the days of the late Victorian, the Edwardian theatre of varieties, the direct ancestor of Hollywood spectacular. They know what a good show looks like. So you've got to put on a good show. And if you look at Victoria's Jubilees, to a lesser extent, the first of 1887, but dramatically for the second, the Diamond Jubilee of 1897, these are modern un-British ceremony. So suddenly, this is the ceremony that we Brits do so well. There are lots of soldiers in impossibly tight jackets. By the way, the regiments competed to how tight their bottoms were and how much they stuck out, all marching up and down, beautifully to time, perfectly played music, everybody doing the right thing. If it looks like Ruritania, it's because it is. If it looks like a Cecil B. DeMille spectacular, it is because it's a direct ancestor. It is a popular performance, and it works brilliantly. It makes a monarchy a public show, a spectacle. What in the 1920s, when they'd actually got used to Hollywood spectacular, led to the fact that the British royals were labelled the only true film stars that we've got. It's performance, it's stardom, it's celebrity. Now that represented a huge shift in the public perception of the monarchy, and you can see the sequence. You have, first of all, the beginnings of democracy. Then you've actually got to alter the monarchy as performance. No longer to an aristocratic coterie, but to a much, much wider audience, and a less understanding, and an infinitely less tolerant one. But in fact, democracy, the beginning of the mass electorate, was something that was relatively easily surmounted. There came, a few years later, a much more radical challenge. The great year of transformation, we were talking about actual years this morning, the great year of actual transformation of the British monarchy is 1917. Right, the year of the Russian Revolution. It is the year when monarchy throughout Europe tottered and most of them began an inevitable fall that swept away the three great empires of Russia, Germany, of Austria, and cut a swathe through the remaining crowned heads, but not the British. The British reaction to 1917 is fascinating. The first thing is that it was the king, not the radical liberal Prime Minister Lloyd George, who refused the Tsar and his family refuge in Britain. That despite the fact that they were his first cousins. Because George, exactly like Isha, was terrified of revolution. Terrified at this time, not of democracy, but actual red revolution. There are repeated mutinies, most of them relatively minor in the army, some very significant in the navy at this time. There is, of course, a huge war being fought with gigantic casualties. The monarchy is frightened. And the response is not simply fear, the refusal to admit Nicholas and Alexandra. It is also, really surprisingly, reinvention. Now, George V is the least likely candidate for thinking new thoughts you could imagine. Ladies and gentlemen, he collected stamps. Now, of all forms of human activity, philately seems to me to hit the absolute basement. If there are any philatelists in this room, cover yourselves in shame, go out your collections and give the proceeds to Cambridge, and you will re-enter the human race. But he not only, George V not only collects stamps, he is obsessed with meteorology. The first thing he does every morning is to measure the temperature and note the wind direction in this monstrously tedious diary of his, written on lined paper and in an extraordinary round hand. But George is in fact extraordinarily shrewd. Not clever, but shrewd. And he realizes the two things that have to be done. The first is, of course, that as part of this transformation, we haven't yet quite had to go so far at Cambridge, you change the name. If anything, the name of the Royal House of Britain at this point was something like Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which is kind of inconvenient if you're fighting the Germans. So what you do is you literally repackage the thing, you rename it, and they did it in a completely modern fashion. They market-tested alternatives. And the one they come up with, of course, finally, Windsor, is just so good. It's a little touch of Shakespeare. Merry Wives of Windsor and all the rest of it. It's a very large touch of medieval myth, romance, chivalry, with the Garter, whose headquarters are at Windsor. And then finally, I think it was already associated with, sort of woods of Windsor, sweet smells, touches of lavender, that faint sense of the English countryside, all carefully packaged up for Americans. So it is a brilliant choice of name. And that's the thing that people traditionally focus on. of the changes of 1917. But that seems to me to be, although it's important, it's only, as it were, the outer wrapping. The change at the core, the thing which is so crucial, and it will not surprise any anthropologists in the room, is in marriage customs. Marriage customs are absolutely central to understanding strange tribes like royals. And up to that point, the rules of the marriage of the British monarchy have been governed by two factors. The first, following the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, in which there had been another extraordinary change. Up to that point, from the Reformation, in other words, from Henry VIII to William and Mary, every new monarch had changed the religion of the country. Until finally people got a bit fed up with this and thought it would be much more logical if instead the monarch had to change his religion to suit that of the country. It would make things much easier. So you introduce the rule that no Roman Catholic can be either sovereign or indeed can marry a sovereign of Britain. And that means then the first rule is a kind of endogamous rule. You've got to marry within the group of European Protestants. The second rule is also endogamous, but comes from a different culture. From the beginning of the 18th century, hence the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha business, the British monarch is in fact a German prince. And German aristocracy had much, much stricter rules than the English aristocracy. They practiced what the French call dérogeance. That is to say, if you marry outside your own social rank, it is not a full marriage, it's a morganatic marriage, and your children cannot inherit. So not only does a British monarch have to marry a Protestant, you have to marry a serene highness. The trouble is, because rather few German princely families are Protestant, you will find yourself usually that you've got 1.5 women that a royal prince can marry, and half of them are mad. It is very, very difficult, which is why certain deeply obscure dynasties like Teck constantly crop up in the marriage pattern. Now, the problem with these marriages is, of course, that they are effectively arranged marriages. There's as much arranged as Indian or Pakistani typical marriages nowadays. You can't pretend that they're love affairs. Sometimes they change into a love affair, like Victoria and Albert, but you can't really present them like that. What, in fact, George does in 1917 is something staggering. He says, from this moment, and he actually notes it in his diary, in that strange schoolboy round handwriting between the stamps and the weather and the temperature and the fact that the weather was unseasonably cold. I mean, all of it's there on the page. He says, this is so much like the diary of Adrian Mole. This was an historic day, he says, because today I published an order in council that my children could marry English men and English women. Now, that changes everything. In other words, they can marry subjects. They can meet people in reasonably natural social intercourse in the London scene and fall in love with them and marry them. And they do just that. And the most important of these marriages, which takes place within the following 5 years, is the marriage of the king's second son, the future George VI, to the future Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. And that wedding is presented just like Diana's. There are the new popular press with the new easy availability of photography, new women's magazines. You have shots of the interior of the house in Piccadilly. You've got shots of the house in which she was brought up. You've got interviews with her nanny. You've got reports on what the trousseau will be like. You've got gossip from her friends. And the whole thing is blown up into a national love affair. And this also has the other crucial effect. It transforms the monarchy from this rather remote institution into an object of popular fascination, especially, it has to be said, with women. And also, it means that the royal family becomes the key thing. The British monarchy becomes the royal family, and the royal family becomes the great British royal family, the symbol of unity. Now, why do I say that? Because remember, these are dim and distant days. Divorce, which I'll return to in a moment, wasn't heard of. It was infinitely rare. And the one thing that everybody, of whatever class, particularly not the upper class, who had a bad record even then and could afford the immensely elaborate processes of divorce, but what the monarchy, the middle class and the modest working class could agree on was the importance of marriage. It was a cement, it was a unifier. And the British monarchy survives and thrives now, not as the apex of the social pyramid, not as a glittering aristocratic institution, but as a representative sort of ersatz middle-class family. It is brilliant. It's also achieved at quite enormous cost. It's achieved at the enormous cost of the suppression of the movement for divorce law reform. There is a completely new history of 20th century England to be written in terms of resistance to divorce law reform. The necessity for divorce law reform was recognised right at the beginning of the 20th century by the Liberal government, and you set up a divorce law commission which was blocked. And you'll all be pleased to know that the blocking was done by Oxford. It was done by a phalanx of clergy and canon lawyers from All Souls, centering round Anson, who was the warden of All Souls, and the future Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, and they block divorce law reform. And the key thing to understand is that the monarchy not only becomes the representative of the great British family, it becomes the centre of a new kind of national religion. The national religion is, of course, centred on the Church of England. Now, I made abusive remarks about the absence of Christianity in the Church of England. But if you go into an old-fashioned Church of England, up towards the altar, indeed if there is an altar, you will be struck by the almost complete absence of Christian symbols and the omnipresence of Union Jacks and regimental flags. What the English are doing there is worshipping themselves. And Westminster Abbey, of course, is the national shrine, but it's not filled with saints. Heaven's sake, Isaac Newton's there. It's filled with the great. It's filled with the secular great. In other words, this is Shinto. This is worship of the national spirit. English Shinto. It's the worship of national spirits through the King Emperor, who is the centerpiece of this. But it also has a single article of faith. It's not, love the Lord thy God, love thy neighbour as thyself. It is, thou shalt not get divorced. There is a single moral test, which is avoiding divorce. And the monarchy is deployed staggeringly effectively as the institution that keeps this together. And a whole series of other features of national life. The Church of England is one of them. The new BBC is another. Reith is the key figure along with Cosmo Gordon Lang, and fascinatingly enough, they're both Anglicised Scots, the most dangerous breed that exists, as we see from our present government. And Reith imposes this test brutally within the BBC. The chief engineer is forced to resign because he gets divorced. And, of course, well known is the fact you can't be presented at court if you're divorced, you can't go into the Royal Enclosure at Ascot if you're divorced, you can't enter into society if you're divorced. And Lang deploys this absolutely brutally. The fascinating thing, of course, is that Lang is gay. The official lives have changed. There's been this transformation in our understanding of sexuality since the 1960s. But if you look at Lang's official life, published shortly after his death in, I think, 1946, it describes two scenes that I'd like to have in your mind of this great bastion of family morality. The first is the moment when he is inculcated into the Church of England at the Cuddesdon, the Oxford training, it all goes back to it. Anyway, the Oxford Training College for Church of England clergy, coming from a background of the Scottish manse. He wasn't, of course, used to seeing clergy in cassocks, and he enters the the dining room, where the assembled postulants and the man in charge, the Bishop of Lincoln, are all seated at dinner in cassocks. And he's clearly very nervous. He is seated next to the Bishop of Lincoln, in charge of all of this, and the Bishop of Lincoln, who's a kindly soul, recognizes the young man's anxiety, and I am now quoting from the official life. Firmly grasping his thigh, the bishop said to the young Lang, "Young man, I see you are disturbed by the company, but don't worry. These young men are not as holy as they look, and I, squeezing harder, am the naughtiest of them all." The scenes at the back of the archiepiscopal rolls, which were again quite extraordinary, as the Archbishop, after a major speech or major sermon, would settle, it is described, giggling and relaxing in the company of his two favourite chaplains on the back seats. Quite extraordinary. But this man is the orchestrator of the family monarchy. He creates the coronation, particularly the coronation of George VI, as the grandest, most formal show. In comparison with the coronation of Victoria, it has 11 rehearsals. It is infinitely polished. But why is George VI the second son on the throne at all? Because of divorce. That is to say, his elder brother, Prince David, the man who briefly reigns as Edward VIII, wanted to marry a twice-divorced American. The only sin that was worse than being American was being divorced, and the only sin that was worse than those two was being twice-divorced Mrs. Simpson. Now, everybody thinks that there is some rule which says that a British monarch cannot be divorced or marry a divorcee. There is no such rule. It was simply this tremendous orchestration of the monarchy into the defence of middle-class morality. That's the only reason that the abdication crisis happens. And of course the result of the abdication crisis is that you put on the throne the most model couple of all, George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. It works brilliantly. It works brilliantly when they're succeeded by Queen Elizabeth II, who begins her reign by saying, it's interesting, she doesn't say she wants to continue this 1500-year tradition of the British monarchy. She's no interest in history at all. When I took around an exhibition of her great ancestor, Queen Elizabeth I, the only thing she could do when she stood in front of a picture of Queen Elizabeth was to summon Philip and say, "Isn't that mine?" It was like half the things in the exhibition, but still. So it's a housekeeping view of history. Elizabeth's view of history was simple. She said she wanted to be like her father, George VI, and her grandfather, George V. And she was, until the disaster of Diana. Until the moment at which the idea of the monarchy as the defence against divorce, the monarchy as the protector of the family, exploded. But of course, the British family had already gone. We'd embraced the American ideal of divorce too. We have this problem then. The monarchy which survived and thrived, adapting itself to democracy and becoming the representative institution through representing the British family, suddenly, at the end of the 20th century, found itself robbed of a role. Nothing to do, nothing for it to stand for. And the only reason that it survives now is arguably the most important force in human nature, in the same way it's the most important force in physics, inertia. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If you'd wait, and we have microphones available. If those with microphones could stand up or come forward. Oh, there are the microphones at the side there, are they? If you could come to the microphones that are on either side of the auditorium there and ask your question, and then everybody will be able to hear it. First question, please. Stunned silence, right. So the microphone is just by you.
My understanding was the most important principle in physics is entropy, which is constant change.
It shows that I'm a historian and not a physicist, right?
But in general, what do you see for the monarchy in the next 20 years?
I think it's impossible to predict the future because I am a historian, and historians are not very good at doing that. The monarchy survives at the moment because all alternatives are even worse. If you look at the prospect of President Tony Blair, the most ardent Republican in Britain instantly is converted to, a brown-noser of the House of Windsor. And if New Labour had retained the kind of popularity which it had in '97, I think the future of the monarchy would look very dim. But at the moment, even Charles, will probably survive. It'll be difficult. For it genuinely to survive, what you will have to do is to find a new purpose. But remember, and again, this is something I think that Americans don't often register, more than half European countries, Western European countries, are monarchies, including many of the most democratic and prosperous. France, of course, is a republic and a catastrophic one. Just look at the number of French constitutions. This is going back to your point about constant change. Five republics, 2 monarchies and 2 empires. Extraordinary. Arguably 3 monarchies, because Charles X is so different from Louis XVIII, and then the Monarchy de Juillet of Louis Philippe. But the really successful European countries, the Netherlands, Sweden, now Spain, and so on, they are all monarchies. But in all of those countries, it's very easy to identify what the monarchy does, in exactly the same way that it was easy to identify what the British monarchy did for most of the 20th century. In Spain, the monarchy is the emblem of renewed democracy. In the Netherlands, it is the key emblem of passionate small nation nationalism. If you look at the Dutch football team, it does not wear the national colours. It wears orange, the colours of the House of Orange, exactly. The same is true in Sweden, where it looked as though the monarchy was going to disappear in the 1970s. The monarchy in the Swedish constitution survives by a single word. There's one word in the Swedish constitution. It was deliberately designed so that the monarchy could be amputated with the least problem. The most interesting example is Belgium, where apart from Catholicism, chocolates and child abuse, the only true Belgian institution is the monarchy. Otherwise, the country is totally split down the middle between the Wallons, the French speakers, and the Flemings. So the monarchy is Belgium. Now, none of this was true before 1946-47. So that's the period where you get Farouk of Egypt saying, soon there will only be 5 kings of the world, 4 in a pack of cards and the King of England. The British monarchy had been unique in this process of adaptation. Now it's been taken over. And unfortunately, there's nobody in Buckingham Palace with the brains of Reginald Brett or Cosmo Gordon-Lang. There really isn't. Sir, could you go to the microphone?
Was Princess Diana assassinated? And if not, why not?
I think that's the best question I've ever had, yes. Shall we just applaud? Maybe the British Secret Service sensibly felt she was doing such a good job of self-destruction. They would have, given her a little bit of rope to hang herself, and instead an alternative method occurred. No, of course she wasn't. The thing is, like so many historical events, what you see is what you get. But her behaviour, of course, was completely destroying her popularity, at least on the other side of the Atlantic. The extraordinary affair with Al-Fayed's son and so on. The increasing erraticness of her general behaviour. No, there was no need. There was no need. In fact, if she hadn't died, can you imagine Princess Diana 45 and showing the signs of substance abuse, which is undoubtedly what we would have seen? She wouldn't have been a pretty sight. So she has a great... Dying young is a huge advantage. It's a really smart career move. It doesn't begin with James Dean. The one of Henry VIII's queens who is most successful is Jane Seymour. She does what none of the others were able to do. She produces a son, and then she dies 13 days later. And at which point she becomes the perfect wife. If you look seriously, look in the Victorian novel. The good wife is the dead wife. You know, you go to heaven, you wear white, your husband and children pray to you every night, and you can never put your foot wrong. So Diana, it was a very smart career move. Really smart career move. She probably planned it. That's right. But seriously, Diana is again a phenomenon that really is worth taking seriously. Not in the kind of neo-feminist approaches of many American historians. It's what happens when modern celebrity and monarchy collide with each other. There's always been an element of celebrity in monarchy. You know, going right back to, we talked a little bit about it this morning, Erasmus's reaction to Henry VIII. He describes him in recognizable terms of celebrity. Henry VIII himself, as I hope to show in my new biography published by HarperCollins in 2009, at some vast cost, I trust, Henry himself is obsessed with the idea of fame. But the problem is, modern celebrity is something very different. Modern celebrity is about a kind of intestinal exposure, a turning of the human being inside out, and its natural conclusion is death. Or flirtation, you know, like Elizabeth Taylor, a long-delayed flirtation with death. It's very sick. And that's not what you want from a public institution. I think we've time for just one last question. Yes, certainly. The gentleman who's actually about to hog the microphone. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Where did Harry get that disgusting shirt? And should he have been allowed to go to Sandhurst under those circumstances, without some sort of delay at least?
We're referring, of course, to the Nazi fancy dress that the young prince was stupid enough to wear. I think there's something very important to remember. Harry is a second son. Second sons are expected to behave badly. They have no other function. They're there to provide a kind of entertainment. It was monstrous that he wore it. It reflected no good whatever on Eton, that a young man would be so idiotic to do that. But he's a not very bright 18-year-old, subject to this hideous light of publicity.
A future artillery officer, no doubt.
I think you'll do very well in the army. The army, unlike Cambridge, is very good at taking really bad material and knocking it into shape. And it does it very successfully. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.